When the Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II as it is widely known, convened at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome in 1962, Pope John XXIII proclaimed it was time to open the windows of the Roman Catholic Church and let some of the modern world's fresh air inside. Catholics today, including those who serve the Church in religious life, are still being impacted by the many changes it brought. In part 2 of his two-part series, reporter Steve Kiltonick explains how the Council impacted Catholics and answers the question, can the spirit of the Second Vatican Council be recaptured?
After 3 years and 4 sessions, Pope Paul VI brought Vatican II to a close on December 8, 1965. After much debate, the 2,000 bishops of the world ultimately united and produced 16 documents, which were broken down into 4 constitutions, 9 decrees, and 3 declarations. Ultimately, the Council introduced major reforms within all aspects of the Catholic Church. Vatican II renewed the priesthood and religious life, enhanced the role of lay Catholics, opened dialogue with other churches and non-Christians, identified the Church as the people of God attuned to the problems and hopes of the world, and modernized the liturgy. One of the more visible changes that came out of the Council revolved around the liturgy. Now, prior to Vatican II, the priests had to face the altar and say the Mass only in Latin. After Vatican II, the priests could now face the congregation and say the Mass in English or the vernacular of the parish, which could be Italian, French, Polish, or even Spanish. The idea was to open up a dialogue between the celebrant and the congregation.
People began to understand that they did have much more of a role in the life of the community, and that they were not to simply be passive, that they were to become active members of the community.
People started to volunteer more and get involved in parish councils, committees, and religious education. Springfield Bishop Christopher Weldon was described as cautiously optimistic about the reforms. After Vatican II ended, he immediately called for a presbyteral council comprised of diocesan priests who advised him and assisted parishes in the educational process. Another major change came from the document Gaudium et Spes, which addressed the Church's role in the modern world.
Gaudium et Spes says that the Church has to read the signs of the times, which means the Church has to respond to the issues here and now. It can't be focused so much on the past that it forgets to respond to what's emerging right before its own eyes.
The document Perfecte Caritatis dealt with the renewal and adoption of religious life. At the close of Vatican II, Sister Eleanor Dooley was in Paris working on her doctorate. She returned home 3 years later to witness the changes.
I would say the greater number of our sisters, perhaps almost all of them, came to accept Vatican II beautifully and to really sort of internalize the spirit of it.
Sisters were no longer required to dress in habits.
We were free to assume the address of our founders, and that was wonderful because I think it enabled us to be more at home in the world, not to be conspicuous.
Vatican II also allowed the former Sister Maria Assumptor to drop her religious name.
Going back to my baptismal name meant a great deal to me because it was like returning to my roots, my fundamental identity as a child of God.
The Sisters of St. Joseph still remained educators, but also became more involved in non-traditional ministries, including prisons, shelters, soup kitchens, and other social service agencies. Other documents of Vatican II included Ad Gentes, which expanded the view of how the Church evangelizes. All Catholics now were called to holiness and to be a missionary through their own lives. Lumen Gentium proclaimed that the Church is a light for the world and the source of salvation, while the family is the true domestic church. And Sacrosanctum Concilium described Holy Communion as the foundation of the Church and the main source of God's grace for Catholics. To honor the 50th anniversary of Vatican II, Pope Benedict XVI proclaimed a year of faith to strengthen the faith of Catholics. A half-century later, the question remains, can Catholics now recapture the spirit of Vatican II? Bishop Emeritus Remy Deroux, who was a participant at Vatican II, has lectured worldwide and written extensively on the Council for nearly 50 years.
Everywhere I go, I'm finding audiences of very interested and frequently quite excited people who are really glad to know that there are people elsewhere in the world as well who think as they do, that Vatican II is indeed a great step forward in progress in terms of the mission of the Church to proclaim the good news of the gospel.
Father Stelzer feels that while there is still widespread lack of familiarity with the Vatican II documents, it's never too late to recapture its spirit.
Let's just take the time now to celebrate the gift of Vatican II. And if we didn't in the first time have the opportunity to understand what was there, let's take the time now to go back and just look at those documents together, look at what happened in the council.
Perhaps the lessons of Vatican II can be summed up in this quote from a leading theologian. Vatican II is not about replacing what the Church is. It's about helping it to be more vitally what God intended it to be in the first place. For Real to Real, I'm Steve Kiltonick.